So we're recording.
We're recording, and welcome to the Beer Money America podcast. And what I keep thinking for a tagline on this is, it's a non-political political talk because so many times you have these talks as you're sitting around, particularly when you're meeting people, and there's always some topic that leads you into politics. It seems like.
Yeah. I think, something just saying like, talking about politics the way non-politicians and normal people talk about politics. As I say, it's a podcast about having a discussion about, life and how politics impacts life. And so, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. And where it kind of came up, and I'll do a shout out to Stone. When we all first kind of got to know each other, it was around just having a little quick drink and just getting to meet each other through trying to figure out a new way of doing things in the political world. But so that's why it kind of ended up being kind of called the beer money thing. But to that extent, what's been going on in your world this past week? You've been traveling a bit and stuff, right?
Oh, well, I go back in between Los Angeles and San Diego County. So, traveling, so to speak, but more or less just a few hours, up and down the coast here and there. I can just say that I recently moved to North County from Los Angeles. So I still have friends and family in the LA area. So I get back and forth and, I have to deal with some business type things in LA every so often. But, when it comes to traveling, it's not traveling much.
It's not.
But I wanted to talk to you about the beer money podcast thing because, we'll do a little shout out here on my side too. Let's see.
Right. Catherine. Right.
That ain't beer. Because I think when people think about beer money, I get this image of like a big glass jar full of change and it's, what are we going to spend? What beverage are we going to spend our money on? And while I will admit the majority of people listening to this are probably big fans of beer, I'm a fan of cider more so than beer. So I think that some people might come around to my side and spend their beer money on cider. So since you're opening a beer, I'll open up a cider.
Cheers.
And hang on. Let me get it in the glass. Yeah.
So that's another difference. So are you a glass person or a can 100%. Person? Glass.
Well, the thing is, I think that metallic items, including like silverware, can sort of, taint the taste of things a little bit. So I prefer to drink things out of a glass if I can. So I'll always pour. And that's what I say. So I think we have a lot of potential here for a lot of conversation because I think we got a lot of differences on a lot of things.
Yeah, it's weird. When I'm out somewhere, I much prefer draft beer, straight from, so it's in a glass. But then when I'm at home, I guess I'm just too lazy to go get a growler filled up with draft. And it's just like, okay, give me it. And the only reason why I do cans versus bottles is because at least with cans, you can kind of recycle them a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And I have a neighbor that we pack up all of our plastic bottles and cans and she takes them over and, she's on a fixed income and she takes them in and turns them in for money. And it's like, great. At least my conscience is clear a little bit on that.
Yeah. As I say, the recycling thing is actually kind of an interesting thing to talk about too, in a way. Cause, apparently so much of the recycling that we do in various cities gets shipped out to different countries, or it apparently isn't getting really done and just gets dumped in the landfill anyway. So it's like, that's kind of an interesting thing. Cause, for the longest time, the idea of the blue bin and you're going to put all your recycling in the blue bin and, it seems like a good idea. But if the government isn't actually executing on its promise to recycle the things that it says it's going to recycle, then the whole thing falls on its face.
Well, the recycling market's just kind of gone away. We used to ship so much of it off to China and other places, right?
Right.
So it's one of those things where they haven't figured out a real solution. Now, I'll have to send you a podcast that I heard a little while ago from here in Vista, California, where we're both from, a discussion about that from the guy who runs EDCO, the waste
Yeah,
management.
the waste management. Yeah.
And he claims that they still are recycling almost 100%, which
Hmm.
that's pretty contrary to everything I've heard everywhere
Yeah.
else.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
and particularly with like they do a lot of with the residuals from restaurants and things that they can actually burn safely, and
mhm.
they have a energy generation process that's allowing them to take and remove a lot of that from the landfills. I'm just telling you what he said. I have no third party and validation of all that, but it's a crazy one. What
Yeah.
do you do?
But that's the thing, if Edco is coming through on that, then
Yep.
fantastic. I mean,
Yeah.
more power to them. But again,
Yeah.
like you say, it does run contrary to the things that we've been hearing about, the
Oh,
research. So,
absolutely.
so yeah.
I've heard things like today, on average across the country, it's like 10, 12% maybe is recycled.
Yeah.
And the rest is going back into the landfill because they just don't have a market for it,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
crazy.
again, uh, if you want to start getting into the political side of things, one of the things that I was looking at was the Vista's city council agenda. And apparently, what the next thing on the agenda is, they're having some sort of meeting to talk about the environmental planning for the city for the upcoming year.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me was when I looked at it is basically what they want to do and what they're being mandated to do, I think, by the state of California, is that they want to build more electrical vehicle charging stations. And the thing that struck me about that was, okay, that's what the state of California wants, but is that really best for the people who live in Vista and our community? I mean, how many electric vehicles are there? And it got me thinking about a whole bunch of things about, you know, these these big mandates that come down from on high, you know, I don't think are necessarily the best things that the community could be doing. And recycling is just such an obvious, issue that, if Vista dedicated itself to being the number one recycling city in the United States, well, I mean, I think it could probably, in a lot of respects accomplish that. But instead, it's going to spend some, gigantic sum of money to build
Mm-hmm.
electrical vehicle charging stations, which is not necessarily that's not a community first kind of idea about, how to handle, anything
Yeah.
environmental or anything that's even worthwhile. So,
Yeah. How do you
I'll just,
have, I'm always perplexed about in fact, I'm in the process of thinking about buying a new car here in the next 6 months or so. And I keep going back and forth. It's like, I want to do electric, right? But
yeah,
there's a lot of gotchas with it, right? Still.
yeah,
But I keep thinking back, okay, well, back in, the early 1900s, there weren't a whole lot of gas stations either, and it evolved over time, right? And so it's the same with electric, but at the same time, it's like, we weren't traveling very much back in the early 1900s,
yeah.
driving back and forth to LA once a week or something.
Oh, yeah,
That just
yeah.
didn't happen. Right.
But yeah, it's interesting because this is one of my sort of bugaboos about electric cars. Some of the first cars ever built, and there's a big museum in LA called the Peterson Automotive Museum. If you go there,
Yep.
they have examples of this. You can see these electrical cars that were built in like the 1880s, 1890s. And they're basically the same as electrical cars are now. You got a battery hooked up to an electric motor and it runs the car. And so the thing about electric cars is unless you have better batteries, much better, much more efficient batteries, then you're just trying to sell essentially an old technology that was already beaten out by the technology you're trying to get rid of. I mean, way back in the 1890s, people more or less decided that gasoline powered cars were more convenient than electric cars. Electric cars were there. They could have said, hey, electric cars are great. We'll do electric
Yeah.
cars. But they didn't. They decided that, fossil fuel powered cars were more effective for what they wanted to do with a car. And now, again, because this is kind of me, the government comes down from on high and says, sorry, can't have the kind of car that does the kind of thing that you want it to do. You have to adopt this other car, which, got rejected in the 1880s. So there's some good technology on the horizon that says these cars are going to be better soon. And I'm all for that. I'd love to have a very efficient electric car. I mean, I can
Yep.
have a million reasons,
Who would?
efficiency,
Right.
cost of repairs, because I mean, electric motors are pretty much fail safe. They're amazing. So there's a lot of reasons to like electric cars. But again, when you have a one size fits all mandate coming down from on high, is that really the community centric solution? Is that the best solution for this part of the country, for some other part of the country? I mean,
Right.
it's tough.
It is, and but again, it's one of those balances. Like at some point, you have to have a milestone or some reason to get people focused, right? Because
Yeah.
and in the political world, it's very hard to get anything done on a good day.
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah.
right. So if you don't have some kind of, squeeze play to force people into doing something, I kind of see why they do some of those things. Now, when it comes to, what is it? By 2030 or 2035, California is going to outlaw the sale of new gas
Yeah.
cars. Yeah, at least that's what they're saying now. And it's like, I get it. I mean, it's good to have a goal, but what I think is going to happen on that is people are already holding on to their cars longer than they used to,
Yeah.
just because they're so expensive, and so it's just going to probably have a huge impact on the industry itself. But I guess time will tell.
Yeah, well, as I say,
crazy.
that's the thing. You sort of head down a rabbit hole because you've got some political agenda, and if you guessed wrong and the technology doesn't show up, you're going to have a lot of problems.
I know, and at the same time, I keep reading more and more about the hydrogen fuel stuff, which in my mind could make even more sense.
Yeah,
because you can fill it up fast and it's still carbon neutral and all those things, but that technology still quite isn't there yet. But that seems to make more sense than electric cars in my mind.
Well, I've thought for a long time that fuel cells, well, again, this is a whole bugaboo for me. I personally think that, the way forward would be hydrogen fuel cell cars coupled with nuclear power. Because if you had a nuclear power plant, it's almost always built near a water source because it needs it for the cooling, can use the water and hydrolyze it into hydrogen. So you're using clean power to make clean hydrogen, and then you use the clean hydrogen to power the cars. To me, that would be, a really outstanding way forward. But again, and this will be a constant thing during this podcast, I'm sure. When government comes down from on high and says electrical cars are the thing, and they subsidize the production of electrical cars, subsidize the purchase of electrical cars, that drives us nail through the heart of the fuel cell industry. Because why would you build fuel cell cars when you can get huge subsidy to build electrical cars? So all the research and all the technology that could have gone into a really great idea, like fuel cells, and had better research, moving faster, more ideas, gets torpedoed by the government picking winners and losers. Electrical cars are the thing, except when they're not. And so that's the problem.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. It's just crazy. So I keep trying to think how to get people more engaged with those kinds of discussions. One of the things that drives me crazy is like this past week or two, all I was hearing, well, number one, my wife's a Kansas City Chiefs fan. And so that's bad enough. But number two, so this whole Travis Kelce thing with Taylor Swift keeps coming up in these games that I'm forced to watch. And and it's just like people are just like going crazy over the fact that these two people are dating, which is great. I'm glad they're dating. And it's just like, why can't people get as excited or animated about, these issues compared to hey, is Taylor going to keep Travis Kelce around, or is it going to end up in one of her songs, a year or two down the road? And it's like, I keep trying to figure out how do you get people engaged? Because, people, number one, we're still only having about half the voter age population vote to begin with. And then of that half, about half votes, right? So I mean,
Right.
it's like
Yeah.
it's like why? What is it going to take to get people kind of get as excited about this? Then what do they call it? It's the trailer. They're the trailer couple, Tracy Taylor. Yeah, that's they're coming up with
Yeah,
their
Kelce
short
Taylor.
name.
So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. So it's
but
like
yeah, I think
you know,
I was just gonna say I think part of it is relatability. You know, relationship stuff and dating and it's kind of exciting, it's like you can kind of like for me, for instance, I can remember back when I was young, and first starting to date, it was new, it was interesting, it was exciting. And I can still look back at that and say, okay, those were my golden years. I was young and healthy and fit and I went out with girls and I went to parties and did this and did that. And I think that, when you have relationship stuff, I mean, everyone can kind of relate to that, right? It's like relationships. Everyone's had at least some kind of relationship with someone somewhere along the line. But when you start talking like policy stuff, a lot of it is just like wonky stuff and no nonsense that nobody wants to listen to. And it's like, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I've always said that one of the reasons that some politician does better in a poll or an election than another one is a lot of times the simplicity of the message. I mean, like if you can just say, well, we're going to just sell everybody, non-polluting energy and everyone will be happy because there'll be no more pollution. And everyone's just like, yeah, that sounds great. So we'll do that.
right,
I mean,
right,
putting
right.
aside the fact that it's incredibly complicated to try and accomplish something like that, but it sounds good and it's simple. So, you get, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, young, attractive, popular
Yeah,
individuals. People look at that and they're like, that's great. That's cool. I like that. And they're into it.
right.
And then you come along and you tell somebody, well, lithium ion batteries versus solid state batteries, what are we going to talk about there? And so, I think a lot of it is a relatability issue, but just, one thing that I think that we could do to have maybe like better outreach would be to come up with something like a podcast. If we had a podcast that we could talk about issues like this, then, you'd have more of an outreach. So, I mean, we could
There you
consider
go.
doing something like that.
Yeah, right. There you go. I think that's a great idea.
Hey, and I can't even take credit for it. I met this guy and he was great and he had this idea about doing a podcast. And I was like, great.
Well, there's nothing new in the world. Obviously, there's a lot of podcasts out there that I listen to, but so many that are political in nature just are like, and I'm sort of I'm interested in politics and the news and all that. But some of them are just like, oh my gosh, just leave it alone about, the
Yeah.
machinations that politicians have to go through because you miss the forest for the trees, right?
Yeah.
And so many of these things are just, okay, let's just try to, and that's why I think it's so interesting where, I might have mentioned this before, since I've been kind of more involved lately in kind of the independent movement, that I swear every night I'm listening to something or somebody or reading something, and there's just seems like this pent up demand where people are just done on two-party politics.
Yeah. No, I completely
And
agree
so,
with you.
but I'm trying to decide, is that really the case, or is it just the case because I'm interested in it now? It's kind of like when you get you go out and buy a new car, and then all of a sudden you see your same car being driven by other people.
Yeah.
They'll pick the same car as you did at the time, right? So is it just that I'm more sensitive to it now, or is it a reality that people are just done?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a lot of the feeling that, people are kind of done with politics. But again, I think one of the great things that we can do with this podcast is try and sell people on the idea of, a new political party, which is exactly what the country needs, and all the reasons that are for it.
Yep.
And one of the things that you mentioned was, how kind of like nasty some of the podcasts are that are out there. There's all this venom and just anger and hatred towards one side or the other. But that is facilitated by the two-party system. When there's only one adversary, if you can just convince everyone that your adversary is the worst person in the world, then they have no alternative but to vote for you. If there are more adversaries, in other words, if there are more parties, more candidates, more choices, just demonizing your opponent becomes less effective, at least in my eyes. That's what I'd say. Because you
Mhm.
can't just say person A is the worst person in the world, and oh, by the way, so is person B, because one or the
Right.
other has to be the worst person in the world. They can't both be. And so, you know, if you can't just demonize your opponent, now all of a sudden you start having to sort of justify your positions. And once you have to start justifying positions, then you start having to talking about ideas or doing things differently or how would things change. And the creation of a new party interjects that conversation almost by its very nature. So if you could create a new party that was, viable, that people would actually be willing to vote for, then, I think you just have a lot more calm, rational discussions, kind of like what I'd like to say is the conversation we're having right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think one of the things that's been interesting in the last uh, few months since I've gotten a little more involved is here in California with the Common Sense Party, not to necessarily just shout out at them because there's other
Yeah.
parties out there too, is they're focusing on let's start at the local level
Yeah.
versus trying to, hey, we're going to elect the next president. And I think that is an important difference I see happening out there.
Yeah.
Um, because at the end of the day, like we were talking about, you know, trash and should Vista have electric charging stations on. At the end of the day, it's all that local stuff that probably
Yeah.
impacts your day so much more than what they're doing in Washington, which at this point is really not a whole lot since
Yeah.
they can't agree on who's supposed to run the place, right? So uh, that's what's fascinating to me is how that seems like another way in for people if you can just get them energized to think, hey, if you do worry about your whatever city council, what they're doing, or even your local trash company, whatever, right? That it's not necessarily the sexiest thing. It's not Travis and Taylor Swift, but
Yeah.
it's at least a little more relatable, which is something, you kind of started off with. You got to relate to something.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more than relatable than what's happening locally.
And I can sort of also add another note to that because I was a Ross Perot third party person way back, 30 years ago when the Reform Party was starting. And the ultimate
I
demise
loved
of
his
that party
graphs.
was, say that again?
I loved his graphs. He always had
Oh, yeah.
graphs and
Yeah. No, I'm a big graph guy myself. But I was just going to say that part of the reason the party died is when Ross Perot kind of gave up on the situation because
mhm,
the party itself was almost sort of like a cult of personality. When that personality
yeah,
was gone and it got taken over by Buchanan, well, I mean, it just died. So
yeah,
it's just from a practical sense. If you want to start a new party that's going to be viable, you're going to have to find a community in an area that will support that and have an ideology that's plausible and pleasing enough to the people who hear it that people will want to vote for it because of the party, not because you have, some presidential candidate that suddenly people think
right,
that they might want to glom onto.
right, right. Yeah. Well, you just, at least at the local level, I don't know, you seem like you have more, well, you definitely have more as an individual leverage on what's happening because
Yeah.
like here in my district of Vista, um, the two people that were running were separated by just a couple hundred votes.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like so whoever won that race was going to have to realize that, okay, I've got to work with a pretty diverse group of people that I represent.
Yeah.
And so when you get it down to that level, there just seems to be a little bit more, reasonableness and common sense going on. Doesn't, it's not perfect by any stretch, but I do notice that you see it in other cities too. Now, I don't know about LA. LA, you would
Yeah.
know LA more. The difference between LA and Vista, I'm sure, is, gargantuan as far as how things work. I mean, LA is a country unto itself, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, LA. Yeah.
you probably get a lot of weirdness that you wouldn't necessarily get in Vista or Escondido or San Marcos or something like that.
Well, another thing too about LA is that because of like gerrymandering, when you have a really high population density, you can really cut up districts and make them, kind of into anything that you want. So,
Yeah.
people look to make these districts that have like very specific voting blocks in them that sort of dominate everything that goes on. And so I think in a place like Vista where the population is a little more diffused out, you're sort of forced to take a whole bunch of, sort of a more diverse group of people than in LA where you can sort of like pick and choose what you want the districts to look like. But yeah, LA is a mess. It's really bad right now. I mean, it's one of the reasons me and my wife, we moved down here to Vista. So yeah, LA is a scary place right now.
Well, and I don't think LA is a whole lot different than most big cities. You can go to Miami, Chicago, New York, you name it, Dallas. I was having a discussion with a friend of mine on the East Coast he leans very conservative, and he was talking about the whole smash and grab thing that's going on, and LA has gotten so much publicity about that. And he's basically saying, he wasn't saying it in so many words, but he's basically saying, well, that's what you get in a blue state. And it was like, well, wait a minute. They're doing this in Miami and Dallas, and if you Google smash and grab, it's going on everywhere. The only reason why LA gets so much is because what they're going after. They're going after Gucci bags and iPhones, stuff that you're not going to have necessarily in Dripping Springs, Texas, right?
Yeah.
And so but that's not. I understood his point that his thing's like, they need to start cracking down and enforcing and blah, blah, blah. It's like they do, but it happens everywhere. It's just LA's, got a lot of, it's like the whole, who was his name? Willie Horton, the bank robber that said, when they asked him why you rob banks, it's like, that's where the money is. It's the same, it's kind of the same theory, right? I mean,
well, as I say, there's a lot of ways you can sort of look at that. First of all, I would put a finer point on what your friend said. It's not blue states, it's blue cities. Because there's like places like Dallas. Dallas is as blue gets. It's in the middle of Texas, but it's run top to bottom by the Democrats. So I mean, if you want to go that route, I'm sort of on board with that. But I think there's also a lot to be said about population densities and understanding the impact that population density has on a lot of different things. Now, it's true the Democrats are setting the policies for these cities, and if you want to get into policy on that at some point, I'm down with it. It's because I think their policy is bad. For instance, Los Angeles, I think, just recently set no cash bail for like all kinds of things, like second-degree murder. I think they even set for no cash bail.
Right.
That's not going to work out. It's going to be bad. And so, blue city policies are definitely a problem. But again, population density matters. You look at that. You look at areas of high crime, high poverty, high whatever. It's by and large, a lot of the time, it's in very high population areas.
Oh yeah.
You put a lot of people in a small space, and they all have to interact with each other. A lot of stress. A lot of stress and a lot of problems. And so I think with, if you have rural areas where people are more spread out, you can kind of like contend with it a little bit easier. But when you have a huge mass of people that can move in and out of any place they want in a huge wave all at once, well, that's hard to deal with.
It's all about group dynamics, right?
Yep.
Well, and people don't, I think people take offense sometimes who live in California when I'll hear people that I know talk about, I'm moving, I'm going to go move to Texas or whatever.
Yeah.
And I just encourage them. It's like, please do.
Yeah.
I want you to move. I mean, I think if it's great for you, go for it. Because, California could lose 10 million people and we'd still be fine. And, you know what I mean? Yeah. And spread them out. Go, and anymore with so much work from home kind of stuff going on and stuff, you can live in Nebraska or Iowa and still have a decent living and be whatever, so I think it's a good thing. And so I'm not anti demigration out of California. I'm very pro. Because it would help everybody.
One of the arguments that you could make for federalism, in other words, the breakdown of power, and so that individual states are more powerful than the federal bureaucracy, is that when you have states that are different, if people want to move and have a different experience, there are other places you can go that are doing things differently. And,
Yeah,
you can learn some stuff. Maybe one state does something really smart and then other states can adopt it.
absolutely.
Maybe a state does something that's really dumb and the other states can avoid doing that. But
Yeah,
once you have like top down, federal government domination of everything, then, you lose a lot of choice. You lose a lot of opportunity. And I think that that's bad. So
yeah,
when I hear people moving, I'm like, freedom of choice, freedom of mobility.
exactly.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and no, and even though I tend to lean more to the left side of things, I think there's a lot of people that are recovering Democrats like myself that are no longer Democrats, um, that understand that while there's good intentions, I think with a lot of these things
Oh, yeah.
where you're trying to create a more perfect union, you can take that too far sometimes. And even though the intention was right, when it comes down to implementation, it just gets really complicated. Right.
Yeah. As I
That's
say, I
where
think,
the beauty, that's where I love seeing stuff happening at the local level
yeah.
and trying to get reasonable people at the local level. And you can't ever ignore what's happening on the grander scale, but because you'll get yourself in big trouble because somebody will do something really stupid. But kind of build up from there versus, to your point, from the top down. Oops.
Yeah. But yeah, one other thing is that a part of the reason I think that some of these bad decisions that get made don't, get overturned more quickly is because there is this sort of divisive nature of our politics. It's like you can't admit that you're wrong because if you do that, then everyone's gonna say, look, see, they're admitting that they were wrong. They shouldn't have done that. We were right. They were wrong. And it's like instead of just fixing things or, choosing a better path, it's all about defending your turf. So it's like
Right.
no matter what happens, you can't change directions because if you do, you're admitting you're wrong. And so it's just like it's a landslide down a hill. It just builds and builds and builds, and it gets worse and worse. So I was like, again, to go back to the idea about politics and how would you change something? What would you do to make something better? If there were multiple parties with multiple positions on things, you wouldn't have to be on the defensive so much about ever admitting anything. Because you say, oh, these people sometimes have good ideas, sometimes those people have good ideas.
Right.
You can find workarounds within, the different groups, but right now you can't really do that.
No, not at all. Well, I think the goal was try and keep this to about 30 minutes. So we're kind of there right now.
Yeah.
But before we wrap this up, I've got a burning question. Why cider?
So first of all, cider is America's drink. It's not German. Beer is German. Merca, cider. So that's one
Wasn't
reason.
that what wasn't mead and cider and all that? Wasn't that kind of coming over from with the Vikings and stuff? Am I remembering that right?
Mead, I think the you could sort of attribute mead to the Vikings because actually here's a little natural fact. Bees are not native to North America. All bees came over from Europe. So all that honey
Oh
stuff,
yeah,
European. So one of the crops that the colonists could grow in the Northeast were apples. The Johnny Appleseed legend, And
right.
so Americans have been making cider and apple-based stuff for ages. And so that's one thing, just joking around more or less, America. But the other thing is I can't stand hops. And everybody puts just all these hops in beer, but beer technically isn't hops. Hops was originally added to beer, I think, as a preservative. And it's very bitter and unpleasant tasting, in my opinion. So I generally go away from beer. I've had some beer that I like. I'm not going to just tell everybody that, beer is 100% horrible. And I get it.
Some
And it's
wheat
personal
beers or
taste.
whatever. Yeah.
But, so I kind of like beverages that have a more fresh taste. I like beverages that have a little bit of fruit in them. As a kid, you grow up drinking apple juice and that's very sweet, but cider in a way,
Right.
you let the sugars ferment and it turns into alcohol and it takes away a lot of seeds, but it still has that sort of natural, fresh fruit tasting taste to it. So I'm quite fond of cider. But the problem is that there's not a lot of it. There's not like if you
Right.
wanted to go for a beer, you go to the store and you can buy 1,000 different types of beer. And of course, where we are, we're in like the beer brewing capital of the universe.
Exactly.
So I think that if more people knew how good cider was and how just awful beer is, that they would be much more willing to try cider. So that's kind of why I drink cider.
Gotcha. Well, you're going to have to try, what is it called? There's Booze Brothers here. It's a brewery. They
Mm-hmm.
have yeah, they have a beer line that includes a lot more fruit flavors and stuff. Something Al. Why am I forgetting it? I'll get you the name. So
Yeah.
that might be one. It's not all the hoppy stuff like you're saying. So they got a whole line that's just about that. So that'd be something to
Well, I'll
bring
definitely
up.
try it. As I say, one of the things that I look forward to is like if you have suggestions, I will definitely try them because I'm always willing to give my opinion on a new beverage, and I'm going to go through and look for different ciders and ciders that I like, and
Yep.
like for instance, this one I'm drinking right now is from Guthrie Cider Works, and
Yep.
it's good. It
And
tastes like apple.
ciders, and I'm kind of clueless about cider. Cider's different than seltzers, right? Hard
Oh
seltzers.
yeah, see, hard seltzer is what am I trying to say? It's
Because
distilled
that's like the
alcohol.
big thing now, it seems like, is hard seltzers is the big thing now.
Exactly. But they add, the flavors they're adding to them, I mean, some of them are probably using natural flavorings, but a lot of them are probably using,
Yeah.
processed or artificial flavorings. Cider is just apples. I mean, if you look at the ingredients on a can of
Yeah.
cider, it's apples. So I mean, it's like the easiest, most straightforward thing you could possibly drink, basically. So it's clean,
Nothing
fresh
more
tasting,
American than
fresh
that.
tasting. Merca.
Nothing more American than apples, right? So there you go.
Exactly. Mom and apple pie, right?
Exactly. All right. All right, John. Well, we'll wrap it up right now, but this has been great. And
Yeah.
we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, and as I say, it just from a straightforward, practical perspective, I think we could probably have a lot of conversations on a lot of things,
Oh
and
yeah.
we don't necessarily need to complicate it a whole lot in it. I think it goes pretty
Nope.
well. We certainly filled up a
Exactly.
half an hour with no problem.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. I just don't know how many people are going to want to listen to at least me any longer than 30 minutes. So I know my wife doesn't. So
Yeah, you know, I mean, I guess
she'll
the public.
she'll definitely critique it. Believe me.
Yeah, well, we'll hear from Linda here in the not too distant future. So, but yeah, no, again, the marketing and publicity of it and what's popular and what's not. I think that's sort of an interesting thing there, though. It's like you could try to manufacture a show, AI
Right.
style, to be the most popular thing in the world, and I mean, you don't know, it could still be a flop. So who knows?
Exactly.
Maybe there's an audience out there for two people having a pleasant, actual conversation about things.
That's the crazy part. I mean, I live in the marketing world, and everybody tries to apply science to it
Yeah,
because that's what usually the people paying for it want some justification. It's almost impossible. It never happens that way. I mean,
yeah,
this stuff happens because it happens.
right.
You can't explain it.
Yeah,
So
so I
who
mean,
knows?
again, if this is us, then this
It
is
is
us.
what it is, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful.